Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Laura Davis and this is a short video on Flannery O'Connor's short story called A Good Man is Hard to Find. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the story. I'm then going to move on to talk about character. I'm then going to talk about symbolism and foreshadowing, and finally I'm going to talk about grace and redemption in the story. So first let's start with context. So it's important to remember that this story was written in the 1950s in the American South. And O'Connor is a very well-known author. This is one of her most famous stories as well. So the context is really important. So when you think about the context of the American South in the 1950s, obviously slavery wasn't happening anymore, but the history of American slavery was in the minds of the people in that society. And the society was very much influenced by that recent history and long history of American slavery. In the 1950s as well, and this is related to their history in slavery, the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, was very prominent at that time. It was very much a segregated society, and this would have been before the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Okay, so that's an important context to keep in mind because I think it is very relevant to the story. Let's move on to talk about the characters in the story. So typical for short stories, there are just a few characters in the story, and the story itself doesn't take place over a long span of time. The main character is the grandmother, who we get introduced to her right at the beginning of the story, and she's the protagonist of the story. The antagonist of the story is the misfit, who we hear about from the grandmother right at the beginning and who comes into the story later on. So those are really the two main characters, and I would argue that the whole story really focuses around the grandmother herself. Of course, there are other characters who also come into the text, and for example, we have the grandmother's son, Bailey, his wife, who interestingly is not named in the story. We have his two children, and then the baby, the third grandchild of the grandmother. So the baby's barely mentioned. The two children are mentioned a little bit, are somewhat developed, and so is the son. But the wife of the son is very much a flat character, really just mentioned as the baby is. Okay, so those are kind of the main characters. Now, I want to talk a little bit about memory because it relates to the protagonist of the story. And memory comes into the story quite a bit. So notice that as you read through it, the moments when the grandmother reminisces about the past, what she remembers about the past, and what she forgets. There's a real juxtaposition between remembering and forgetting in the text. So I think that's important to pay attention to, because the way I interpret it is that it's not just about the individual characters that are remembering and forgetting, but it's also about the memory of that collective society and American slavery and the very problematic history and ongoing racism of that society. So it's how do we remember that past, that recent past from them in the 1950s, and how do we and in what ways do we problematically forget it, and where's that juxtaposition between the two? So for example, the grandmother, as she's going down the gravel road, kind of remembers the days when there were only gravel roads and that 30 miles was a big day-long journey. Remember the moment when the grandmother remembers suddenly with some horror that it is not Georgia where this plantation they're supposedly going to is, but in fact Tennessee, where she wanted to go at the beginning of the story. So there's a kind of a moment where she's kind of horrified because she's the one that got them to go to this place, and she remembers, oh, we're in the totally wrong place altogether. Memory is also interesting when you think that they're going back to this supposed plantation where there's secret passageways and secret places where the past is kept. So that also relates to the memory of a society, right? What is that past? Can we unearth it? Can we look at it? And what are we going to find when we do? So that's kind of more symbolically, I think, that the notion of finding this plantation is also this notion of turning to that past and staring at it and looking at it in the face. Memory also comes into play with the misfit when he comes into the story and has the conversation with the grandmother. because he doesn't really say, I mean, we don't know whether to believe him or not, but he says he doesn't remember what he's convicted for. That what he does to get into jail, what he does to gain this, to be in the newspapers and be hunted down and so on, be this criminal. He doesn't remember what he's done. That also is really interesting in terms of the society and a collective memory and so on. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about symbolism and foreshadowing now. First, we can think about the grandma's hat as a kind of a symbol, and there's foreshadowing here too. The grandma's hat is described quite a bit. She's described as if she's a lady, very much a kind of white society, lady of society in that time. And it's mentioned that even if she was found dead on the side of the highway, that people would know she's a lady because of her hat. Okay? There's a little bit of foreshadowing there, right? A little bit of irony in the fact that she does end up dead on the side of a gravel road, not a highway, but nevertheless. The hat is then described a few times in the story, and when they have the car accident, it's described as torn and shattered, just like the grandmother herself is, just like people of her era are. I think really this is about the death of this family, but also the death of a way of life, the turning over of into something, maybe into that civil rights movement, a movement beyond the time of large plantations which were built on the backs of the slaves. So I think the grandmother, this is a story about generations in that society, and it's no accident, I think, that the three generations are represented there. There's also foreshadowing in the moment when they stop at, or the scene rather, when they stop at the restaurant called the Tower. Now, if you know tarot cards at all, you'll know that the Tower is a warning. And it basically warns that there might be some impending disaster, an impending crisis coming. So this is very much part of the rising action of the story. The car accident itself is the climax, and the tower, the fact that this restaurant is named the Tower is representative of the warning that something bad is going to come. Also, Red Sam is the person that they talk to at the place that works there, and he also kind of warns them. He talks about these shady characters that were visiting his restaurant recently. They talk about the misfit, and he says he might be in this area, and they talk about how it's not safe these days to leave your doors locked. So very much a kind of warning scene, that whole scene with the Tower and with Red Sam. Now, in terms of symbolism as well, I want to talk a little bit about the notion of the graveyard and the grave itself. This is a very Gothic story, like some of the others we've done in this course. When they go down the gravel road toward the plantation, they see a graveyard. And the grandmother notes that it is the graveyard for the family that lived on the plantation. And she says there's room, I think some kind of comment about there's room for 5 or 6 more there. And of course, there are 5 or 6 of them in the family. If you include the baby, that's 6 of them. So that is a kind of foreshadowing, but I think also symbolic of it's a plantation family, and if they're seen as part of it, there's the sense that there is the death of that generation of plantation owners that she's referring to, and if you look at it in terms of the society as a whole. When they get in the car accident, the sort of climax of the story, they're in a ditch, and you look at how that ditch is described. It's like a grave itself with the dirt on the sides. The misfit's description of the jail, the penitentiary he's in, is also a description of being inside of a grave. He says there's walls on each side, and walls on top, walls on the sides, right? He's closed in the same way that you would be in a grave. Some critics have said that the time when the misfit and the grandmother are talking about the cloudless sky and looking up, that is a moment of baptism, rebirth, redemption of some sort, that it's like the water above at the top if you're immersed in it. So there's that kind of moment which is significant in the text as well, if you want to read it that way. And there is what I would call a moment of grace when the grandmother, right before her death, right before the misfit kills her, says, not only that she knows him, but you are mine, you are one of mine, as if she is his mother. And I think that's really interesting in terms of the society as well, because if she is the generation, she's an older kind of white privileged generation, and of course that white privilege is ongoing, but she has kind of created or mothered the misfits that are the generation after her, which is her son, which is the misfit himself, who calls himself the misfit, the criminal. She recognizes him earlier, remember, from, I suppose, the newspapers and so on. When she says, you're the misfit, she verbally recognizes him. But I think also the sense when you read that part and she says she had a sense of knowing him, but she wasn't sure from where. Again, it invokes the notion of memory, and it invokes a kind of connection between the two, not in a kind of, in a sense that she is tied to this criminality, that the whole white society is tied to the criminality of which they then become victims. The irony, finally, the irony and horror of the image at the end with the woman, the grandmother, smiling. She's dead at this point, but she's got a smile on her face in her death. And I think there's so many different ways to read that. Has she had redemption? Has she had this moment of grace? Or is the smile more of a smirk, more of a kind of horrific smile? Is there kind of some sort of hope at the end? Or is there the sense that even though the society is changing, that there's a sense of the death of the old, that there is still going to be problems moving forward? Okay, so I have talked about the context of the story, I've talked about the characters, I've talked about foreshadowing and symbolism, and I've talked about grace and redemption. Thank you very much for listening.